Hi everyone, K-Dot here. This week I am going to talk a little bit about the next of the city sections in my list, this one being the city section of Ironrock Hold. So how do you get to Ironrock Hold from White Pillar? Well, if you start in the city center of White Pillar, at the White Pillar, you turn west and walk until you reach the Great Gate, which is one of the 4 gates that separate White Pillar from the city sections that neighbor it. These gates are incredibly tall for a medieval style building, almost 200 feet tall. They don't have doors, they're just openings in the walls that separate the city sections. And they tower above everything else around them, even the walls themselves. When passing through the gate, the first thing that you'll see and notice when you transition to another city section is that the road surface will change. White Pillar is known for using a white cobblestone for its roads, whereas Ironrock Hold, having more access to many and varied types of stone, uses more of a red and brown and multicolored granite that shimmers and shines in the sun. So these will be the first things that you'll notice, because in the gate itself, as you're transitioning between the 2 city sections, you'll see that the cobblestones are going to change. And so when you pass through the gate and come out the other side into Ironrock Hold, you'll notice that the temperature is going to be a little bit cooler than what you would have experienced in White Pillar. Not really chilly, but definitely not the coast of southern Italy, sunny, warm sort of weather. So the next thing that you'll notice is that as soon as you get past this kind of buffer zone that exists in every single city section in and around the gates, the population demographic is going to change drastically, particularly in Ironrock Hold and a couple of the other city sections that I'm going to describe. This is because the vast majority, we're talking 70 to 80% of the individuals that live in Ironrock Hold are dwarf, gnome, and dereuger. The uniformity of Ironrock Hold is the way that it is because Ironrock Hold's portals to other worlds tend to connect to the dwarf, gnome, and dereuger kingdoms in these other worlds. Ironrock Hold is currently ruled by a dwarf who is titled as a king, but he's really more like a dwarf noble at the end of the day, and he has a council of other dwarf lords who help him to govern. He is not the leader of these dwarfs, he is the first of equals. It's less of a actual king and more like an oligarchy or a ruling council type of a thing. So these dwarves are not necessarily elected. Some of them are, but typically not. Typically their lord will promote them to a position that will allow them to then gain the title of council member or lord in Ironrock Hold, either through their merits or their deeds on their own world. The size of the council depends on how many currently active and known portals that there are to other dwarf strongholds and worlds throughout the multiverse, and this can change over time. It varies from anywhere between 25 and 50 dwarves on this council that kind of determine the rules for Ironrock Hold. The current First Lord of the Dwarf Council that rules Ironrock Hold is named Jund Garlhammer. He is also known as the Magnanimous, simply because he's very generous with the vast amount of wealth that he has at his disposal, and frequently will give it away to people in need or neighbors that just he feels he needs to help support. He is incredibly friendly for a dwarf, and is well renowned and well liked amongst his neighbors because he is so personable. He also happens to be very short for a dwarf, and consequently his council of lords tends to tower over him, and he has a little bit of a complex about this, but he knows that he is the first among these equals, and so he is more than capable of dealing with any feelings or insecurities that might arise from that kind of thing. So as far as other differences that you'll see in between White Pillar and Iron Rock Hold, the biggest one is how the buildings are constructed. Dwarves, and really any race that comes from a realm that is primarily built around underground kingdoms and those kinds of things, actually don't tend to value stone like others might, because stone is all around them. They will value the ore and the jewels in the stone, but the stone itself is very common for them, and thus very easy and cheap for them to obtain and utilize. So stone would not necessarily, in my head, be the kind of building material that they would use. This is why the majority of Iron Rock Hold is actually constructed of wooden buildings. These are not wooden buildings like you would see from a human, where the building is made out of boards and maybe has a lot of gaps in it, maybe looks a little bit less nice in terms of construction, although a lot of wooden buildings can be very finely made for humans. It's got a very distinctive style. Instead, these buildings are made out of basically whole trees. These trees have been cut down. They are wood, not living tree, and used as whole bricks or boards. So the walls are going to be not necessarily a single board thick, but a single tree thick. And they're going to be carved in such a way that there is no visible gap in between one tree and the next. The only way that you'd even be able to tell would be if you were to get incredibly close to these buildings and inspect, and you might see a hairline somewhere. Because they're dwarves and they value these kinds of beautiful things, every single building that they've got in all of Iron Rock Hold is going to be masterfully carved with bas-reliefs and even some sculptures on the larger sections of the buildings that might be blank. And it's going to be absolutely beautiful, to the point where some of these carvings are so well done that they look like they move as the sunlight shifts either through the day or even as you're walking down the street. And you'll see the sides of these buildings almost animate as you walk by, just because of how good the craft of carving things is and how much time the dwarves have had to work through and have this kind of artwork done on their buildings. As with all buildings in a large city, the roofs are not made of wood. This is going to be the same for any city section that I talk about. The fire risk is too great. Although with the dwarf architecture, having a wood roof might be less of a fire risk than one would think, because with that much of a mass of wood, it's going to take a while for it to even start to catch fire, especially since the dwarves tend to treat their wood with various substances to make it even more fire resistant. However, dwarves tend to use large, massive amounts of wood in individual beams, not boards, individual trees, not just a small part of a tree. So they tend not to make wooden roofs. The roofs that they're going to make are going to be copper and tin. Copper being the sign of more wealth than a tin roof. In closer to the center of Iron Rock Hold, you're going to find the Iron Rock. It's actually not that big and not that impressive. It just looks like a big gray rock sitting in the middle of the central square. There's nothing more that you can really describe about it. The dwarves don't even really pay too much attention to it. They just kind of walk around it and have built not even a park around it. It's the cobbles of their road are just kind of butted right up against this rock, and it's just seen kind of as a nuisance. But they haven't been able to really move it or do anything with it, because much like the White Pillar in White Pillar, there's really no way to deal with this obstacle. The only buildings that you're going to find in Iron Rock Hold that aren't made of wood are the ones that have to do with the manufacture of things that require heat. So places like forges and smelters and foundries, those kinds of places are going to be made of stone because they don't want to have the risk of 2,000 degree molten metal coming into contact with wood and causing it to spontaneously burst into flames. That's just not something that a dwarf is going to do. They're going to be smart enough to avoid that kind of thing. The layout of Iron Rock Hold is going to be very similar to White Pillar, very kind of a straight line grid pattern, not near as complex as what you would find in a dwarven hold that's been carved out of the rock, because they only have one dimension to work in this case. Although dwarven holds tend to be more square and laid out in a grid, kind of like what we would think of from something like Dwarf Fortress. At least the dwarves that I have come up with tend to lay things out more like that, just because Dwarf Fortress is one of the influences I use to think about some of this stuff. You're mostly going to find things like workshops and craftsmen and artisans in and around the various squares that dot the city of Iron Rock Hold. These areas are mostly like markets and that kind of thing. Most, if not all, of the portals are not only well known, but also well documented and well guarded. The dwarves don't like it when strangers suddenly show up in their lands. They are very cordial to individuals that come from other city sections, but going through one of these portals is going to require some kind of a pass or some kind of an escort. You're going to need to basically have permission from the dwarf lords that rule Iron Rock Hold. These buildings would be distinct because they would be much larger than, say, your average dwarf house in Iron Rock Hold. Some would even be made of stone, much like the foundries and the forges, not because they're in danger of burning down, but more because stone is stronger than wood, and it's going to be a lot easier to defend a portal room or a portal building if it is made out of something like stone, where they can seal it up very easily. So as far as major factions go, the biggest and most influential of these factions, the faction that actually has a number of lords that come directly from this faction on the ruling council of Iron Rock Hold, is called the Guild of Shapers. This is the same Guild of Shapers that also exists in the city of the White Portal. This guild actually originated in Iron Rock Hold and was imported into White Pillar as the humans in White Pillar gained knowledge of this kind of craft from the dwarves. That craft being the artisan making of weapons and forging of metals and crafting of anything really with metals and gold and jewels and that kind of thing. The Guild of Shapers is immensely wealthy, immensely powerful, and not only is it a part of the city of the White Pillar and Iron Rock Hold, but also many other city sections in this general area, even upwards of 5 to 10 city sections distant, just because of the vast amount of knowledge and wealth that they have at their disposal. They can gain influence wherever they want. They just need to offer to show people how to make magnificent items out of metal or jewelry. The next most influential faction that you're going to encounter fairly regularly in the Iron Rock Hold is going to be the Engineers Guild. Mostly this is run by gnomes. There's going to be a lot of artificers and actually dedicated engineers who do things like siegecraft and all of that kind of thing, but also more of what we would call like a civil engineer who's going to be able to, build a road and make it last for a while, or make sure a house isn't going to fall over, or even a larger building isn't going to fall over, that kind of stuff. Dwarves are very good at this. Gnomes are even better at this. As I said in talking about the gnomes and the dwarves, the gnomes tend to be the kind of individuals who can go in and say, this sword is great, let's mass produce it. So, tends to be run by gnomes. They have at least a lord typically, although not near as influential as other organizations might end up being in Iron Rock Hold, just because gnomes are not really second-class citizens, but they tend to be more flighty and really don't care as much about politics and honor as the dwarves do. Another pretty big faction and a pretty important faction in Iron Rock Hold is a faction called the Grey. This is a faction entirely of dwargar. This faction exists because the dwargar understand that any fresh gray dwarf that shows up on their doorstep is going to have a hard time integrating into the society within Axiom, let alone the society of Iron Rock Hold. And this faction is there specifically to help transition dwargar from being these horrible slaver type individuals to maybe not necessarily being nice people, but at least being functional and capable of not torpedoing all of the wealth that the dwargar have managed to accumulate in Axiom up to that point in time. Is really kind of a support network for the dwargar more than anything else. The dwargar are definitely one of the smaller demographics of dwarves that are in Iron Rock Hold, but they're not insignificant. It's upwards of 20% of the population tends to be dwargar, just because of how many portals they have and where those portals go to and all of that kind of thing. Dwargar tend to be common in those areas. And then the final faction that you're going to find in Iron Rock Hold is called the Lords of Olrang. Now, Olrang is another world. It's actually another section of another world, and there are a number of portals that connect there. The Lords of Olrang are a group of dwarven nobility that are not on the council, but are definitely noble, and many of them are actual kings in their own right and have their own massive dwarf halls that they can call upon for dwarves and resources and wealth and that kind of thing. They have formed their own kind of secondary council and act as advisors and almost enforcers and police sometimes in certain areas of Iron Rock Hold. There's definitely some tension between them and the king and his council of lords. Not enough to really cause open warfare, but these dwarves are definitely a little bit more adversarial than one might think of for, dwarf community. Just because these communities come from different worlds, different places, and their cultures are slightly different, and so there's a little bit of tension there. The Lords of Olrang specifically have been directed by other nobles in their home continent to not cause open revolt, because the amount of wealth that comes from Axiom and Iron Rock Hold specifically is so vast that nobody wants to jeopardize how much money and power this kind of trade agreement can bring. That does not necessarily mean, though, that there's no tension between these groups of ruling class dwarves, and they are definitely adversarial toward each other and don't necessarily like each other all that much, although they will cooperate for the greater good of making more coin. So as far as trade goes from Iron Rock Hold and the worlds that connect to it, the primary export of Iron Rock Hold, believe it or not, is not ore or precious metals or gemstones or even the finished goods that come from it. It actually ends up being stone. Because the dwarves can get various quantities of different kinds of stone, and they can do it cheaply and easily, they tend to export stone and make a tidy profit off of it. And so everyone nearby imports any stone that they use to build buildings, pave their streets, or even take to worlds connected to the city sections. They get it from Iron Rock Hold because it's just cheaper. This is the vast majority of the trade that happens in Iron Rock Hold. White Pillar specifically is 90% made of stone that comes from Iron Rock Hold. There's just no better place to get good quality stone that is needed for these other city sections and their buildings and even anything else that they're going to build out of stone. That's the primary export. That's not to say that ores and gems and those kinds of things are not exported to other places, just not in near the quantity that stone is asked for from the dwarves. As far as imports, obviously the dwarves really like wood and need wood to build new buildings and maintain the buildings that exist in Ironrock Hold. They also really appreciate having access to fine woods to craft things in their own worlds, in their own dimensions. So they not only import it to Ironrock Hold, but also to points beyond. They're also going to import things like food, some fruits, and those kinds of things, although dwarves tend to brew beer more than anything else. There is some whiskey going on, although that's kind of considered a newfangled thing, much like mead is. So it's all of the normal things that you would think of to import that a dwarf may not find terribly common. Fruits, some kinds of vegetables, not necessarily animals. Dwarves can raise most animals that they would prefer to eat underground. It's a lot of the more common stuff. And then, of course, dwarves will always accept coin for whatever it is that they're selling, whether it be stone, or their weapons and armor, or whatever it is that they happen to have on hand at the time. The last thing I'll talk about here is, in brief, that the City of the White Pillar and the City of Ironrock Hold are very closely aligned. The nobility on both sides see vast benefits to having a very good relationship with each other, and so they do, and they have a huge amount of trade that benefits both of these city sections, and both of the nobilities and all of the artisans in both of these cities see a huge amount of traffic from both sides of these two city sections. So they are very good friends. There is not much that could happen in either city section to change the diplomatic relations between the City of the White Pillar and Ironrock Hold. This relationship even extends to military aid, and I'll go into that a little bit more when I talk about some of the other city sections, because there is some very adversarial relationships with the City of the White Pillar and one of its neighbors, and the dwarves actually do provide military aid if it's needed for that particular situation. Okay, so I think with that I will wrap this one up. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you have a wonderful week ahead of you. If you have the ability to, I hope that you can go out, have some fun, play some games, do something cool, and most important of all, try and remember, be excellent to everyone else around you. It'll make the world so much better of a place for everyone else. Thanks so much. Have a good week.